As the 20th century unfolded, bridges entered a new era, an age defined by unprecedented scale, daring design, and the confidence of nations that saw in these structures a reflection of their modern identity. It was no longer enough for a bridge to simply connect two points. It had to make a statement. Steel cables and reinforced concrete, the twin materials of the century, gave engineers the freedom to dream of spans measured not in hundreds of feet, but in miles. The Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, begun during the depths of the Great Depression and completed in 1937, became a beacon of possibility. Its towers rose like colossal red-orange sentinels above the Pacific, the suspension cables curving in an elegant arc against the sky. For the people of the city, it was more than a crossing. It was a promise that even in hard times, beauty and ambition could prevail. Its color, international orange, was chosen to stand out against the fog, and in the years that followed, it became one of the most photographed structures in the world. Half a world away, Japan was pursuing its own feats of engineering. In the decades after World War II, as the nation rebuilt itself, bridges became symbols of resilience and technological progress. The Akashi Kaikyo Bridge, completed in 1998, would eventually claim the title of the world's longest suspension bridge, its central span stretching over a mile. Standing upon it, one could look down and see the restless tides of the Seto Inland Sea swirling far below, the wind carrying the scent of salt and the sound of gulls. Meanwhile, Europe's bridge story in the 20th century was one of both destruction and renewal. Many historic bridges, centuries old, were destroyed during the World Wars, blown apart to halt advancing armies. Yet time and again, these structures rose again. The rebuilt bridges often blended old designs with modern materials, standing as quiet memorials to the endurance of both craft and community. The Stari Most in Mostar, Bosnia and Herzegovina, first built in the 16th century and destroyed in 1993, was painstakingly reconstructed and reopened in 2004. It is said that when the first person walked across it again, the crowd fell silent, as if recognizing that a wound had been healed. In South America, bridges became lifelines to isolated regions. The Puente General Rafael Urdaneta in Venezuela, opened in 1962, spanned the vast Lake Maracaibo, transforming commerce and daily life for thousands. The bridge, with its slender concrete piers rising from the water, seemed almost to float, its reflection shimmering in the tropical heat. But the 20th century's bridges were not merely about scale. They were about reimagining the very experience of crossing. Pedestrian bridges began to appear in parks and urban centers, offering spaces for walking, lingering, and enjoying the view. Some were adorned with sculptures, others with gardens. Designers began to see bridges not just as arteries of movement, but as destinations in themselves. For all their variety, whether the rugged steel trusses of industrial rail bridges or the sleek, minimalist lines of modern spans, these structures carried a shared quality. They stood as testaments to the human urge to connect. Even as cars sped across them and freight trains thundered through, there was always the quiet moment when someone stopped mid-span to look out over the water, the city, or the countryside, and felt the stillness beneath the motion. In the centuries, great cities, bridges became icons on postcards and symbols in songs. They were painted, photographed, and filmed from every angle. In rural landscapes, they remained more humble, carrying farmers and children, shepherds and shopkeepers, each day without fanfare. And in both cases, the bridge kept doing what it had always done, silently joining places and people. As the century drew to a close, engineers began looking to the next challenge, bridges that would not only cross vast distances, but also withstand earthquakes, hurricanes, and the rising seas of a changing climate. Yet, even with all the advancements, the fundamental magic of a bridge remained unchanged. To step onto one is to begin a journey, and to stand upon one is to stand between worlds. If there is one truth about the story of bridges, it is that their history is not just a timeline of engineering. It is also a catalog of human emotion. By the early modern period, bridges had taken on lives of their own, accumulating layers of memory with every crossing. Some bore the marks of battles fought upon them, others the laughter of festivals celebrated across their spans, and still others the quiet footprints of solitary wanderers whose names are lost to time, that I in Europe. The 17th and 18th centuries were marked by the rise of grand civic projects. Cities eager to display their wealth and sophistication commissioned bridges that were as much works of art as they were feats of construction. Wide stone balustrades, elegant lamp posts, and statues of saints, monarchs, or mythical figures transformed the bridge into a gallery under the open sky. The Charles Bridge in Prague is perhaps the most famous of these, a place where every crossing feels like a slow walk through a living sculpture garden, with the river's reflection adding an extra layer of beauty to the scene that I in many ways. Bridges of this era reflected the confidence of their builders. Materials like limestone and granite were shaped with a precision that testified to mastery over nature. The choice to make these structures beautiful as well as strong suggests that their creators understood something vital, that a bridge is not only a way to get from one side to the other, but also a place where life itself happens, beyond Europe. Cultures around the world were crafting their own versions of grandeur in bridging. In China, the tradition of stone arch bridges reached new heights. The graceful moon bridges, often set in gardens or over ornamental lakes, reflected not only the skill of their builders, but also the philosophical ideals of harmony and balance. To stand on such a bridge was to be invited into a moment of reflection on the water, on the landscape, and on one's own place in the flow of time. I in Africa, where rivers could be unpredictable and landscapes challenging, bridge building adapted with remarkable ingenuity. In Ethiopia, arched stone bridges built during the reign of Emperor Phasilides connected highland communities, making it possible for markets and cultural exchange to flourish. These structures, though often in remote locations, were built to last centuries, standing today as silent witnesses to the caravans and travelers who once relied upon them. The Americas, too, developed their own distinctive bridging traditions. Long before European contact, the Inca Empire had created a network of rope suspension bridges across the deep gorges of the Andes. Made from woven grass, these structures were light, flexible, and renewable. Communities would gather annually to renew the ropes, singing and working together in a living act of maintenance that bound them as surely as the bridge bound the mountains. Crossing one of these swaying paths must have been equal parts terrifying and exhilarating, an adventure that few would forget. The early modern period also brought about the first experiments with materials and designs that would foreshadow the industrial age. In Britain, iron began to make its way into bridge construction. The most famous example, the Iron Bridge at Coalbrookdale, was completed in 1779 and quickly became a symbol of industrial progress. Standing on that span, a traveler could feel the pulse of a new era, a world in which human ambition was no longer limited by the strength of stone or the reach of timber, but for all the advances in design and materials, there remained a certain poetry in the older styles. In small villages, simple wooden footbridges continued to be built by local carpenters, sometimes with nothing more than an axe and a set of calloused hands. These were the bridges that creaked underfoot, that bore the frost in winter and the moss in spring, and that felt deeply personal to the communities they served. In some parts of the world, bridges became sacred. In rural Japan, certain old wooden spans were considered so spiritually significant that they were not crossed casually. One might bow before stepping onto them, or remove one's shoes, treating the bridge as a passage not just over water, but between states of being by the close. Of the 18th century, bridges stood as emblems of human capability. They had evolved from functional necessities into cultural icons, each telling its own story about the people who built it, the lands it connected, and the rivers it crossed. Whether carved in stone, woven from roots, or forged from iron, each bridge was a promise, a testament that humans will always seek to connect, no matter the obstacles in between. By the dawn of the 19th century, the world stood on the edge of transformation. The Industrial Revolution, already stirring in workshops and steam-filled foundries, was poised to reshape not only how bridges were built, but also what they could mean. For millennia, bridges had been bound by the limitations of stone, timber, and rope, materials that, while noble, carried inherent constraints. Now, with the mastery of iron and, soon after, steel, the very imagination of bridge builders could stretch farther than rivers, deeper than gorges, and higher than any had dared before in Britain, where the hum of machinery and the glow of coal fires signaled an age of invention. New bridges began to rise that seemed to defy the rules of nature. Iron, with its capacity for slender strength, allowed for lighter, more graceful spans that could carry heavier loads. The Menai Suspension Bridge, completed in 1826 by Thomas Telford, became a marvel of the era. Stretching across the turbulent waters of the Menai Strait in Wales, it linked the island of Anglesey to the mainland, a feat that would have been unthinkable only a century before. The suspension bridge as a concept was nothing entirely new. Cultures in Asia and South America had built such forms from ropes for centuries, but the application of iron chains and precise engineering allowed these designs to grow in scale and permanence. The image of a bridge swaying in the wind no longer conjured thoughts of danger. Instead, it suggested daring, progress, and the human capacity to adapt nature to purpose. Across the Atlantic, the United States was experiencing its own bridge-building revolution. Expanding railroads demanded structures that could bear the weight and speed of locomotives. The Eads Bridge in St. Louis, completed in 1874, became an icon of American ambition. Made from steel, the first major bridge in the world to do so, it stood not just as a crossing over the Mississippi, but as proof that the nation could marry technological innovation with monumental design. In France, the great engineer Gustave Eiffel made his mark with daring metal constructions. Before his famous tower in Paris, Eiffel designed graceful iron viaducts that seemed to float above deep valleys. These structures were not merely utilitarian. They were declarations that engineering could be as beautiful as it was functional. But the story of 19th century bridges is not only about iron and steel. It is also about the people who built them and the changing rhythms of life they created. Farmers could now take their goods to market in half the time. Children could attend schools in towns once too far to reach in a single day. Trade, culture, and ideas began to flow across these structures as naturally as the rivers they spanned. There was, too, a certain romance to these new bridges. Couples strolled across them in the evenings, pausing at the midpoint to watch the water below catch the last glimmer of sunlight. Street vendors sold roasted chestnuts near their entrances, while musicians performed beneath their arches, their melodies mingling with the rumble of wheels overhead. Even as industrial power surged forward, there remained corners of the world where the bridge retained its ancient intimacy. In mountain villages of the Alps, humble wooden bridges continued to cross icy streams, their planks smoothed by generations of boots. These stood in quiet contrast to the roaring iron spans of the cities, reminding us that progress did not always erase tradition. It sometimes simply built alongside by the close of the century. The bridge had become more than a tool. It was a symbol. Nations competed to build the longest, tallest, and most daring structures, seeing in these achievements a reflection of their own industrial might. Yet, beneath all the grandeur, the essential truth remained the same. A bridge is, at heart, an act of connection, and perhaps that is why people have always been drawn to them, not just to use them, but to linger on them, to watch the water pass beneath, to stand suspended between two worlds, if only for a moment. If the story of bridges in earlier ages was one of necessity and ingenuity, the medieval and early modern centuries brought forth a new dimension, bridges as expressions of civic pride and human artistry. This was an age when the act of building a bridge could transform not only the way people moved through their landscapes, but also the way they imagined themselves as a community. The bridge was no longer just a tool. It was a landmark, a declaration, a kind of stone and timber handwriting that said, "We are here, and we intend to endure that in the towns and cities of medieval Europe." A bridge could shape the fortunes of a place for centuries. The stone bridge over the river Avon at Bath or the Pont Valentin in Caen were not merely crossings. They were investments in the stability and prosperity of the region. To build in stone was to commit to the long term, an act of faith in the endurance of one's people and the enduring value of the connection the bridge provided. Many of these bridges carried not just travelers and goods, but also entire lives along their spans. Some were wide enough to host small houses, taverns, and workshops right above the water. In London, for centuries, London Bridge was a bustling microcity unto itself, lined with shops and homes whose upper stories leaned toward each other across the thoroughfare. The sound of wagon wheels on the cobbles, the chatter of merchants hawking wares, and the occasional roar of the river beneath must have created a sensory experience unlike any other crossing in the world, beyond the cities, in rural landscapes. Bridges took on quieter roles. A single large stone bridge over a clear mountain stream might see only a handful of travelers each day. A shepherd leading his flock, a peddler pushing a cart, perhaps a pilgrim making his way toward a distant shrine. These modest structures, often built by local hands, blended into their surroundings so completely that they seemed less constructed than discovered, as though the stones had always lain there, waiting for feet to find them. In Asia, the art of bridge building continued to evolve with a blend of engineering brilliance and aesthetic grace. In Japan, arched wooden bridges like the famous Kintai Bridge in Iwakuni became celebrated not only for their practicality, but for their elegance. The sequence of graceful curves reflected the surrounding mountains, creating a harmony between human work and nature's design. Crossing such a bridge was not simply a matter of getting to the other side. It was an experience to be savored, with each step offering a new perspective on the river below and the sky above. Farther south, in tropical lands, bridges adapted to an entirely different set of conditions. Monsoon rains could swell rivers into roaring torrents, so builders developed designs that could withstand flooding. In parts of India, stone causeways and stepped embankments turned river crossings into monumental public spaces. People came, not only to cross, but also to gather water, wash clothes, and exchange news. Here, the bridge was not just infrastructure. It was woven into the daily rituals of life. And then there are the bridges that were never meant for wagons or crowds, but for the lightest of travelers, those made from living plants. In the Khasi hills of northeastern India, the living root bridges, grown from the aerial roots of rubber trees, are coaxed over decades to span rivers and ravines. These are structures of patience and foresight, maintained by generations, embodying the idea that some crossings can only be made through the slow work of time. In the Islamic world, bridge building during the medieval period flourished as both a science and an art. The Abbasid Caliphate, the Seljuks, and the Ottomans all invested in impressive crossings that combined practical engineering with decorative flourishes. Carved inscriptions, geometric tile work, and carefully proportioned arches made each structure an enduring piece of architecture as well as a vital link in the trade routes of the Islamic Golden Age. Bridges became places where travelers might pause to read a dedication, say a prayer for safe passage, or admire the meeting of water and stone. By the time the Renaissance dawned in Europe, the bridge had become a stage for architectural experimentation. Builders and patrons began to treat bridges as civic monuments, commissioning designs from the same minds that crafted palaces and cathedrals. Florence's Ponte Vecchio, lined with jewelers' shops, became as much a symbol of the city as its Great Dome. It was a place where art, commerce, and movement met in perfect equilibrium, and where the reflection of arches on the river surface created a scene that travelers would remember for a lifetime. The role of bridges in connecting not just places but cultures cannot be overstated. Each span carried not only goods and people but also ideas, religions, languages, technologies that would ripple outward, shaping regions far from the riverbanks where the bridge stood. They were silent yet tireless agents of change, bearing the weight of history one crossing at a time. Even now, when steel and concrete have extended our reach to unimaginable lengths, there is something timeless about stepping onto an old stone bridge. The sense of continuity is almost tangible. The feeling that you are part of a long procession of human beings who have made the same crossing, for reasons as varied as the stones beneath your feet. The water flows on, the seasons change, and yet the bridge remains, waiting for the next traveler to set foot upon it. If the earlier bridges of humanity were grounded in practicality, by the time civilization deepened its roots, bridges began to occupy a realm that was equal parts function and symbolism. They were no longer mere crossings over rivers or valleys. They became statements about permanence, identity, and the desire of communities to be remembered. In stone, wood, rope, and eventually metal, the ambitions of those who built them can still be read, arch by arch, pier by pier. In the Roman world, bridges became instruments of empire. Roman engineers, with their remarkable grasp of arches and vaults, constructed bridges that could survive centuries of floods and wear. They used a volcanic cement called pozzolana, which hardened underwater, allowing them to set foundations deep into riverbeds. Many Roman bridges, like the Pont du Gard in modern-day France, were not only roadways but aqueducts, carrying fresh water across great distances while supporting the movement of soldiers and goods. They were marvels of both utility and beauty, their proportions so harmonious that they seem almost inevitable, as if they had grown there rather than been built. The Via Flaminia, one of Rome's great roads, crossed several rivers on bridges that are still in use today, more than 2,000 years later. These enduring works tell us something profound about the mindset of the builders. They thought in generations, not fiscal years. A bridge was not simply an infrastructure project. It was a gift to posterity. Elsewhere in the world, bridge making followed its own logic and style. In China's southern provinces, for instance, the wind and rain bridges of the Dong people were covered structures made of wood, built without a single nail. Their roofs sheltered travelers from storms, while their sides provided benches for resting and chatting. Often, these bridges were social hubs as much as they were means of crossing, a place to linger, to watch the river flow beneath, to share a story before continuing the journey. In Persia, bridges were often integrated into larger water systems, sometimes doubling as dams. The Cos in Isfahan, for example, was both a crossing and a control point for the Zayanda River's flow. Its name, meaning 33 arches, reflects the repetition and rhythm that Persian builders favored, a cadence of stone that mirrors the cadence of poetry. In the evenings, the bridge became a gathering place, lit by the warm glow of lanterns, its arches echoing with the sound of footsteps and conversation. In the mountainous regions of Nepal, Suspension bridges made from braided plant fibers gave way to steel cable versions in more recent centuries, but the concept remained the same. Connect remote villages divided by steep gorges. These crossings were lifelines, sometimes swaying alarmingly in the wind, yet indispensable for trade, communication, and family visits. The bravery required to cross them was matched only by the determination of those who built them. Medieval Europe saw the rise of bridge chapels, small religious buildings perched in the middle of stone bridges. Pilgrims would stop to pray or give thanks mid-crossing, their voices mixing with the wind over the water. Some bridges were even funded by religious orders or wealthy merchants as acts of charity or penance. To give a community a bridge was to ensure its survival, to bind it more tightly into the flow of commerce and culture. The artistry of bridge building also began to flourish. The Rialto Bridge in Venice, completed in the late 16th century, is an example of how a bridge could become a city's signature. It is not merely a means of getting from one side of the Grand Canal to the other. It is a stage, a marketplace, a meeting point, a symbol recognized around the world. Beneath its graceful arch, gondolas slip by, and above, merchants and travelers alike pause to look down at the water. As countless others have done for over 4 centuries, empires rose and fell, bridges endured. They were sometimes destroyed in war, only to be rebuilt with the same or greater ambition. In times of peace, they became routes for silk and spices, for ideas and inventions. Their stones absorbed the vibrations of footsteps, hoofbeats, cart, wheels, and eventually motor engines. The materials changed. Iron lattices replaced timber beams. Reinforced concrete replaced brickwork. But the essential idea never did in the modern era. Some bridges have become feats of daring engineering. The Golden Gate Bridge, with its sweeping red cables, was a statement to the world that America could conquer vast distances and harsh conditions. Yet for all its technological bravado, it shares a lineage with the simplest plank over a creek. Both serve to unite where nature divides. And still, there are quieter bridges, less famous but equally loved. The small footbridge in a rural village, the weathered wooden crossing in a park, the moss-covered stones in a forest stream. These are the bridges that live in memory as much as in reality, the ones that feature in childhood adventures or quiet moments of reflection. They are proof that a bridge is not only about where it takes you, but also about the journey across. If the first bridges of humanity were humble, fallen logs and bundled reeds, the bridges that followed began to carry with them a certain dignity. They were no longer merely crossings, but landmarks, markers of a community's skill, patience, and vision. With each improvement in design, with each refinement in materials, bridges became symbols as much as they were tools. In the river valleys of ancient India, bridges were vital for connecting distant villages during monsoon seasons. When rivers swelled and currents quickened, bamboo and jute rope were plaited into strong, flexible suspension bridges that swayed and dipped, responding to the wind and the movement of those who crossed. These bridges, while light, could endure years of seasonal changes, their materials replenished or replaced when weather wore them down. Travelers often spoke of crossing them with a mix of caution and reverence, feeling the boards shift gently beneath their feet as the river rushed below. Far to the north, in the cold reaches of Scandinavia, wooden trestle bridges appeared, their supports driven deep into frozen earth. In winter, rivers often froze, making crossings possible without a bridge at all. But in the warmer months, when ice melted and waters surged, these sturdy wooden structures became lifelines for trade between coastal villages and inland settlements. Over time, some of these bridges were roofed, not for decoration but for preservation. A covered bridge was protected from snow and rain, its wooden beams less likely to rot, giving it a lifespan of decades rather than years. The Inca Empire. Far across the ocean in South America, created a network of rope bridges that spanned deep gorges and roaring rivers high in the Andes. Made from twisted grass fibers called ichu, these bridges were feats of both engineering and community effort. Entire villages would gather to replace them when the fibers aged, singing work songs and weaving the new ropes together. Crossing an Inca rope bridge was an experience of wind, sway, and height, hundreds of feet above the river, with only woven strands between you and the drop below. To the Incas, these bridges were vital arteries of their empire, linking mountain communities in a web of connection that no stone road could match. In medieval Europe, bridge building became a mark of civic responsibility. Cities competed not only to build longer and stronger bridges, but also to make them more beautiful. Stone masons crafted elegant arches, their keystones fitted so precisely that centuries later they still hold fast without a drop of mortar. In France, the Pont Valentin in Cour became famous for its fortified towers, each a reminder that bridges were not only passages but strategic points to defend. In many places, bridges were given guardians. Statues of lions, saints, or mythical creatures stood at their ends, watching over those who passed. In Prague, the Charles Bridge became a kind of open-air gallery, its balustrades lined with statues of saints, each with its own story, each a silent witness to centuries of footfalls. Such bridges were not only about getting somewhere. They were about pausing, looking, and remembering. The Ottoman Empire inherited and expanded the bridge traditions of the lands it conquered. Under master builders like Mimar Sinan, the empire produced bridges that were as graceful as they were strong. Many Ottoman bridges were designed with slight curves, giving them an elegance that softened the severity of stone. Their arches seemed to mirror the flow of the rivers they spanned, as though the bridge itself were part of the water's journey. In Japan, bridges took on a poetic role. Arched wooden spans over ponds and streams and gardens were not merely practical. They were symbolic of transitions, of moving from one state of mind to another. The act of crossing such a bridge was intended to slow the walker's pace, to encourage contemplation. In Shinto shrines, red lacquered bridges symbolized the passage from the human world into the sacred. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution transformed bridge building. Iron, and later steel, allowed for longer spans and lighter structures. Suspension bridges could leap across distances that stone alone could never conquer. Yet, even as technology advanced, the oldest bridges, those made by hand, stone by stone, remained in use. They had been built to last, their foundations sunk deep into the earth, their builders thinking in centuries rather than decades. Today, bridges still carry a quiet poetry. They stand as places of meeting, as vantage points over the flow of time and water. They connect not only physical spaces but also stories, stories of the hands that built them, the feet that crossed them, the lives that changed because they existed. A bridge may be made of stone, wood, iron, or steel, but its essence is always the same: a way forward, a path to the other side, a link between what was and what is yet to come. Rivers have always been both a gift and a challenge to the communities that settled along their banks. They offered water for drinking and farming, a source of food from fish and aquatic plants, and a route for travel and trade. Yet they also stood as barriers. Crossing them was often a matter of wading in the shallows, risking the current, or waiting for a ferry. And so, the bridge became one of humanity's earliest and most enduring inventions, a way to overcome a natural obstacle with patience, planning, and craft. In the earliest days, before stone was shaped into arches or timber was cut into beams, there were the simplest of crossings: a fallen tree spanning a stream, a few stones arranged so feet could skip across without getting wet, or woven bundles of reeds and branches tied together to form a floating surface. These were not permanent, nor meant for great loads, but they were enough for people to pass from one bank to another, bringing them closer to neighboring settlements, grazing lands, and new possibilities. The history of bridges is in many ways the history of human connection. Across the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates divided the land, early engineers began to imagine more lasting ways to cross. Mud brick causeways and timber-supported paths were constructed, though the floods of spring often damaged them. In ancient Egypt, where the Nile overflowed its banks each year, temporary crossings were common, rafts and makeshift wooden platforms. For the season, taken apart when the waters rose again. The innovation of the true bridge, one that could endure more than a season, came slowly. In China, some of the earliest documented bridges were made from stone slabs laid across short gaps, supported by sturdy posts driven deep into the earth. By 600 BCE, larger stone bridges began to appear, featuring primitive arches that distributed weight more evenly. These early Chinese bridges were not only practical, but often decorated with carvings of animals, clouds, or deities, a reminder that crossing a river was not just a physical act, but sometimes a spiritual one that the ancient Greeks built wooden and stone bridges, sometimes supported by piers driven into the riverbed. But it was the Romans who turned bridge building into both an art and a science. Roman engineers perfected the stone arch, a shape that could carry immense weight while resisting the pull of gravity and the push of water. They built with such precision that many Roman bridges stand today, their stones locked together without mortar, the keystone holding the entire structure in place. That a Roman bridge was more than a crossing. It was a statement of empire. To build a bridge was to declare dominion over the land, to ensure that soldiers, traders, and messengers could move swiftly and without hindrance. Alongside roads and aqueducts, bridges became part of Rome's enduring legacy, linking the farthest reaches of its territories. In medieval Europe, bridge building was often the work of monasteries. Monks saw the construction of bridges as an act of charity, a way to aid travelers and pilgrims. Many medieval bridges included small chapels built into their spans or at one end, where travelers could stop to give thanks for a safe crossing. These chapels were often tended by bridge keepers, who also collected tolls to maintain the structure. The materials of a bridge told the story of its region. In forested lands, timber bridges were common, quick to build but prone to rot and fire. In areas rich with stone, massive spans could be built that would endure for centuries. In Asia, bamboo and rope were used to create suspension bridges, light and flexible, swaying gently with the wind but strong enough to carry people, animals, and goods. By the Renaissance, bridge design began to embrace beauty as much as function. Italian cities like Florence and Venice built bridges that were also marketplaces, lined with shops, creating spaces where commerce and community thrived above the water. These bridges were not only feats of engineering but works of civic pride. Their arches mirrored in the water below. In every age, the bridge has been more than a structure. It has been a metaphor. It represents connection, understanding, and the human desire to reach beyond obstacles. Whether made of rough-hewn logs or cut stone, whether spanning a trickling brook or a roaring river, the bridge is a quiet testament to cooperation and ingenuity. Even now, in a world of steel and concrete, where vast spans cross bays and straits, there is something humbling about standing on a bridge, feeling the pull of the water beneath and the steady strength of the structure beneath your feet. It reminds us that we are, and always have been, a species that builds paths to one another. There is something profoundly gentle about the idea of a bridge. It is, at its most simple, a connection, a way of joining 2 points separated by something unyielding. A stream, a river, a gorge, or even a stretch of marshland, all these have stood in the way of humankind's endless wandering. And yet, The moment humans learned to think not only about surviving the moment, but shaping the future, the idea of crossing became more than just a daily necessity. It became a symbol. A bridge was not merely a plank across the water. It was a declaration that what lay beyond mattered enough to reach for. Long before the first stone arch ever rose against the horizon, people were experimenting with ways to get from one side to another without wading through the uncertain depths. We must imagine a time when human settlements clustered along riverbanks, not because rivers were obstacles, but because they were lifelines. They provided water for drinking and washing, nourished the crops, and carried fish that darted silver under the surface. But rivers were also unpredictable. Their currents could swell in the rainy season, their depths could shift, their banks could crumble without warning. A crossing point could be shallow one year and treacherous the next. In this uncertainty lay the seed of the bridge. The earliest bridges we know of were almost accidental in their simplicity. A tree felled by a storm could span a stream, creating a natural walkway. Hunters and gatherers, moving silently through forest paths, might find themselves testing the trunk, seeing if it could carry their weight. And in that moment, balancing on bark above rushing water, they discovered the power of a passage that did not require wet feet or a struggle against the current. These natural bridges were soon imitated by human hands. A sturdy log could be deliberately placed across a narrow river. Over time, the logs were paired, widened, and secured with vines, giving them more stability. Some of the first constructed bridges may have been made by ancient nomadic groups who needed quick, temporary crossings. Picture a few poles lashed together, laid across rocks, the whole structure lasting only long enough for a caravan to pass. There was no thought yet of permanence. The bridge was a tool, not a landmark. But as human society began to settle and grow roots, so too did our bridges change. The idea of building something that would remain for years, even decades, began to take hold. In places where wood was plentiful, timber bridges began to appear. In dense forests of Europe and Asia, thick beams were cut and shaped into simple spans, where bamboo grew tall and strong. As in many parts of ancient Asia, it became the favored material, light yet resilient, able to bend without breaking under the weight of travelers. The making of these early bridges was as much art as necessity. Builders had to understand how the materials behaved, how water would flow beneath, and how to anchor the structure to withstand the pull of a swollen river. But the story of bridges is not merely the story of materials and methods. It is also the story of why. Why build at all? What compels people to link two pieces of land instead of walking around or staying on one side? The answer lies in trade, in friendship, in conflict, and in curiosity. A bridge could unite two villages, allowing them to share goods, stories, and festivals. It could allow farmers to reach fertile land across the water without needing to haul produce through miles of winding detours. And sometimes, bridges were built because a leader wanted to demonstrate power and generosity. To create a crossing was to say, I care for those who must travel, and I have the means to make their journey easier. In ancient Mesopotamia, along the slow, silt-heavy rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, we can imagine wooden footbridges linking trading posts. In early China, rope and plank bridges stretched across mountain gorges, their swaying steps daring travelers to trust the engineering of their makers. In the lands of the Indus Valley, people may have laid stone slabs over shallow channels, forming crossings that felt as permanent as the earth beneath them. The idea of the bridge as a place, not just a way to get somewhere else, also began to emerge. Travelers might pause at the midpoint to rest, to look at the water, to greet someone coming from the other direction. A bridge could be a meeting place, a stage for small exchanges, a quiet platform for watching the sunrise or sunset. Even in its earliest days, the bridge was more than a construction. It was a gesture. It said, we do not let nature's boundaries define our limits. we find ways to connect. And as centuries passed, that gesture would grow in ambition. The humble log across the stream would give way to the rope bridge. Over the canyon, to the stone arch that stood unmoved for hundreds of years, to the sweeping spans of iron and steel that seemed to float in the air. But here, at the very beginning, the story is still simple. People look across water. They see a place they want to be. They take what they have, logs, vines, stones, and they build a way to get there. And with that act, the idea of the bridge enters human history, quiet and unassuming, but destined to become one of the most enduring symbols of civilization. By the dawn of the 21st century, the idea of what a bridge could be had shifted once again. No longer confined to the practical realm of transporting people and goods, bridges became canvases for architects and engineers to blend art, technology, and environmental sensitivity into one unified statement. The structures of this era were often conceived not just to meet a need, but to inspire awe, to become cultural landmarks from the moment they opened. One of the defining trends of the new millennium was the pursuit of elegance through minimalism. Advances in materials science, high-strength steel alloys, carbon fiber reinforcements, and lightweight concrete composites allowed spans that seemed to float effortlessly across water and valley. The Millau Viaduct in southern France, completed in 2004, epitomized this vision. Stretching across the Tarn Valley, its towers rose higher than the Eiffel Tower, yet the bridge itself appeared delicate, almost ethereal. Drivers crossing it found themselves suspended in the sky, with clouds drifting below and hills rolling away into the distance. Elsewhere, environmental integration became a key consideration. In Norway, the Storsesundet Bridge, part of the Atlantic Ocean Road, curved dramatically over a stretch of open sea, designed to harmonize with the rugged coastline while withstanding fierce storms. Travelers spoke of the strange exhilaration of crossing it during wild weather. Waves crashing against the piers, spray leaping up toward the road, and gulls wheeling overhead. In Asia, China began an unprecedented program of bridge construction, driven by rapid urbanization and economic expansion. Some of these were engineering marvels on a scale never before attempted. The Danyang Kunshan Grand Bridge, completed in 2010, stretched over 102 miles, making it the longest bridge in the world. Spanning wetlands, lakes, and rivers, it was less a bridge than an unbroken ribbon of human determination, tying together vast regions into a single connected corridor. But the new century also brought bridges designed for the human scale, with emphasis on public experience. The Helix Bridge in Singapore, opened in 2010, wound across the water like a strand of DNA, its stainless steel structure gleaming in the tropical sun. At night, it glowed with thousands of LED lights, drawing residents and visitors alike for evening walks. Couples leaned on the rails, watching reflections ripple in the bay below, while children pointed to the passing boats that in many cities. Footbridges became focal points for urban renewal. London's Millennium Bridge, despite its famously shaky first days, quickly became a cherished part of the Thames skyline. Its clean, modern lines drew pedestrians between historic landmarks, St. Paul's Cathedral on one bank and Tate Modern on the other. Standing in the middle of the bridge, one could see centuries of history layered in the surrounding architecture, the old and the new linked by a single elegant span. The symbolic power of bridges in the 21st century grew even more pronounced. They appeared in political speeches, artistic installations, and global ceremonies as metaphors for unity and progress. In a time when many felt the world was increasingly divided, the image of a bridge, solid, steadfast, and open, held a special resonance. Technological innovations allowed bridges to become smart, embedded with sensors that monitored stress, temperature changes, and even traffic flow in real time. These systems helped ensure safety and extended the lifespan of the structures, but they also hinted at a future where bridges would interact more directly with the people using them, perhaps adjusting lighting, sound, or displays to create a personalized crossing experience. Still, even with these futuristic capabilities, the core essence of a bridge remained the same. It was a space between destinations, a threshold that invited both motion and pause. For some, crossing a bridge was a daily necessity, taken without a second thought. For others, it was a deliberate act, a walk at sunset, a photograph with loved ones, a quiet moment leaning on the rail and watching the world move. And so, as the 21st century continued to unfold, the bridges of the age stood as both guardians of the past and harbingers of the future. They carried the weight of history while stretching confidently toward what was yet to come, embodying in steel, stone, and concrete that timeless desire to connect, to span, to bring together. The farther into the 21st century humanity moved, the more bridges began to embody a philosophy that blurred the lines between utility and artistry. The notion of a bridge as simply a structure to move people and goods had been evolving for centuries. But in this era, it became an intentional stage for cultural expression, environmental respect, and sensory experience. One of the most striking developments was the embrace of organic design principles. Inspired by the forms of nature, branches arching in the wind, rivers meandering through valleys, the skeletons of ancient creatures, architects began to weave natural curves into their designs. In Spain, the Zubizarreta Bridge in Bilbao offered a gentle white arc across the Nervion River, a visual counterpoint to the bold industrial landscape around it. Its translucent walkway allowed light to filter through, creating a soft glow beneath the feet of pedestrians. Meanwhile, sustainability became more than just a word in architectural briefs. It became an essential design mandate. Materials were chosen not just for strength, but for environmental footprint. Bamboo and recycled metals appeared in pedestrian bridges across Asia and South America. Solar panels embedded into guardrails powered subtle evening lighting, while wind turbines tucked discreetly into bridge towers generated renewable electricity for nearby neighborhoods. Across the Middle East, bridges began to take on a dual role as cultural beacons. In Dubai, a pedestrian bridge designed with intricate latticework patterns became a modern homage to traditional Islamic geometric art. By day, its repeating shapes cast playful shadows on the walkway. By night, it glowed softly, a lantern over the water. Visitors lingered there not only to cross, but to breathe in the slow rhythm of the place. Some of the era's most daring experiments came in the form of kinetic and transformable bridges. The rolling bridge in London, for example, curled in on itself like a steel caterpillar when river traffic passed beneath, then unfurled again for pedestrians. In Rotterdam, a floating bridge adjusted its position with the tides, its deck gently rising and falling as if breathing with the SEA coastal towns of Scandinavia. Small community-built wooden bridges began to attract attention. These were often constructed by local craftspeople using traditional joinery techniques, with no nails or modern fasteners. Only careful interlocking woodwork and ropes treated with natural oils. Though modest in size, they carried with them a quiet beauty, a reminder that the human desire to connect is as much about care and craft as it is about grand engineering feats. The symbolic resonance of bridges continued to flourish in literature, film, and everyday conversation. Authors used them as settings for moments of transformation, characters pausing mid-crossing to reflect on choices made and paths ahead. Filmmakers employed their sweeping lines to capture a sense of movement between worlds, both literal and emotional. Even in casual speech, to build a bridge retained its powerful meaning of reconciliation and unity. Technological experimentation pushed boundaries even further. Transparent glass-bottom walkways allowed daring pedestrians to looked directly into the depths below, over rivers, valleys, and even urban streets. At night, some of these bridges became immersive light tunnels, with shifting colors and patterns designed to evoke different moods, from the calm blues of ocean waves to the fiery gold of a sunset. Despite all the variety in form and material, a unifying theme began to emerge: bridges as places to slow down. Designers incorporated benches, gardens, and even cafes into their spans. Some included spaces for street musicians, turning a crossing into an experience. In certain cities, weekend markets were held on bridges, with stalls spilling across. The length of the structure, the smell of fresh bread and roasted coffee mingling with the hum of conversation. And so, the bridges of this chapter in history were more than connectors of land. They were connectors of lives. They became spaces where travelers stopped mid-journey to take in a view, where strangers met in passing, where local traditions could be celebrated in a setting that naturally welcomed all who came. In these silent arches and graceful spans, the heartbeat of civilization was not only preserved but nurtured, carrying forward an ancient truth that the act of crossing is as meaningful as the destination itself. By the early decades of the 21st century, the idea of the bridge had evolved into something that transcended its purely physical function. It was no longer enough for a bridge to simply stand firm against wind and water. It now needed to engage with the senses, the spirit, and the environment in equal measure. This new philosophy was visible in cities, rural landscapes, and even remote wildernesses, where bridges took on forms and functions once considered fanciful dreams. One of the most captivating trends was the blending of bridges with living ecosystems. In parts of India and Indonesia, ancient traditions of growing root bridges from living trees found a revival. These structures, cultivated over decades, were neither entirely man-made nor entirely natural. Instead, they were the patient result of human hands guiding nature's growth. Visitors crossing such bridges found themselves not on cold steel or stone, but among living, breathing roots, leaves whispering above and the earthy scent of moss beneath their feet. In urban centers, green bridges began to appear, structures planted with trees, shrubs, and wildflowers along their span. These crossings doubled as linear parks, inviting people not just to pass over, but to linger in shaded seating areas, surrounded by birdsong and the fragrance of blooming flowers. The High Line-inspired designs appeared in cities from Melbourne to Milan, softening skylines with a ribbon of nature. Architectural daring reached new heights in places like China, where glass-bottom suspension bridges stretched across dizzying gorges. Tourists with steady nerves walked across, staring into the depths below, the sensation of floating heightened by the lightness of the transparent panels. At night, subtle LED lighting turned these walkways into ribbons of luminescent color suspended. In darkness, blending engineering with pure theater. In certain coastal regions, tidal bridges emerged as feats of engineering harmony with the sea. Built on flexible supports, they rose and fell with the water, their decks always level despite the ocean's changing moods. For fishermen and locals, these bridges became communal gathering spots, where conversations drifted as easily as the tide beneath them. The cultural role of bridges continued to grow in the public imagination. Writers penned entire novels where bridges were the silent observers of unfolding human dramas. Love affairs, departures, and reunions played out on their spans. Painters captured their curves and shadows, while photographers sought the perfect moment when sunlight or fog transformed their form into something ethereal. In Northern Europe, experimental light bridges emerged, structures almost invisible in daylight, but, after sunset, revealed themselves in arcs of soft white or golden light. Crossing one felt like stepping into a dream. the surroundings fading into darkness while the bridge glowed gently beneath your feet. These ephemeral designs became symbols of transience, beauty, and human ingenuity all at once. Rural communities, too, embraced bridge building as acts of cultural preservation. In small villages across Africa, artisans constructed footbridges from woven reeds and hand-hewn timber, echoing designs that had served generations before. These were not monumental in size, but monumental in meaning. Threads of connection woven into the social and geographic fabric. Throughout it all, a shared global understanding emerged. A bridge could be both a path and a place, a line drawn, not just across water or land, but across time and memory. Whether wrapped in vines, illuminated with gentle light, or humming softly with the footsteps of strangers, each bridge told a story, not just of where it stood, but of the hands, minds, and dreams that brought it into being. In the high, windswept mountain valleys of Central Asia, bridges have never been mere structures of utility. They were, long before the first surveyor's rope or steel girder, a lifeline between worlds, slender threads binding together valleys carved apart by rivers that roared with glacial melt. Imagine a landscape where the land itself is both friend and adversary. The mountains feed the rivers with snowmelt and rain, but those same waters cut valleys so deep that to cross them was to risk your life. A bridge, in such a place, was more than timber or rope. It was a promise that the other side was reachable. For countless generations, these crossings were handmade, shaped from what the mountains themselves offered. Builders would cut timber from the lower slopes, gnarled pine, fir, or larch, dragging it up to narrow passes where the rivers surged far below. Rope was woven from plant fibers, often yak hair or twisted grasses, sometimes mixed with strips of rawhide for extra strength. The bridges were narrow, just wide enough for a person or a sure-footed mule. To walk across was to feel the whole structure sway with the wind, every step a negotiation between balance and trust. Spring was the season of renewal and destruction. As the snows began to melt, rivers swelled to their fullest, carrying boulders and ice with a force that could snap ropes like twine. Many bridges were seasonal, rebuilt every year once the thaw subsided. Communities treated this as a ritual. Young men and women carried fresh materials, elders gave instructions, and children watched wide-eyed as the old, frayed remains were cut away and new strands were knotted into place. These gatherings were part work, part festival. Songs were sung not just for entertainment, but to keep the rhythm of pulling and braiding in unison. In the 20th century, change arrived in the form of steel cables, concrete anchorages, and prefabricated decking. Governments, aid organizations, and engineers sought to replace fragile crossings with permanent ones, bridges that could survive monsoons, avalanches, and decades of use. In some valleys, this shift was welcomed. No longer would a sudden flood strand an entire village. In others, it brought mixed feelings. The old rope bridges, with their living creak and sigh, their intimacy with the elements, had been part of the community's identity. Now, steel stood in their place, solid, unyielding, and strangely silent. But tradition did not vanish entirely. In Peru's high Andes, the Incan rope bridge of Quetzalcoatl continued to be rebuilt annually, just as it had for more than 5 centuries. The community gathered for days to cut ichu grass, twist it into thick cables, and braid those into the great ropes that would span the Apurimac River. The work was dangerous. Men hung suspended above the chasm, hauling and tying with practiced skill, but it was also deeply ceremonial. Offerings were made to the spirits of the river before construction began, and when the bridge was complete, a celebration followed, with music, food, and dancing on the newly finished span in Nepal. In Bhutan, long suspension footbridges linked villages separated by sheer cliffs and roaring rivers. Prayer flags fluttered along their lengths, sending blessings into the wind with each ripple. Crossing these bridges could be both terrifying and exhilarating. The boards beneath your feet rattled with each step. The river far below appeared through gaps in the planks, and the whole span seemed to breathe with the air currents. Yet these crossings saved hours of climbing and descent, making trade, schooling, and healthcare possible for remote communities. Mountain bridges were not just about physical passage. They were about exchange. At either end of a major bridge, small markets often emerged. Herdsmen might sell wool and dairy from their flocks. Traders might arrive with salt, tea, or tools. Stories, too, were traded, news of births, marriages, political events, or distant relatives' fates traveled no faster than the people who carried them. In this way, a bridge was as much a conduit for ideas as it was for bodies and goods. Legends grew around these crossings. Some spoke of guardian spirits who demanded offerings before granting safe passage, a coin tossed into the water, a scrap of bread, or a whispered prayer. Others told of cursed bridges that shook violently if the wrong person stepped upon them, or enchanted ones that could vanish in mist. Children grew up hearing tales of ancestors who built the first crossing, often portrayed as figures of ingenuity and courage who faced not only the natural dangers of the river, but also the unseen forces believed to dwell in the landscape. From a technical perspective, mountain bridges represent some of humanity's earliest and most persistent feats of engineering. Rope bridges are deceptively complex. The load must be evenly distributed across the anchoring points. The tension must be balanced to allow movement without collapse, and the materials must withstand constant abrasion from wind, moisture, and shifting weight. In older designs, redundancy was key, multiple ropes for each support, so that if one failed, the others would hold until repairs could be made. Modern engineers, learning from tradition, began incorporating synthetic fibers into traditional forms. Polypropylene and high-tensile polyester replaced plant fibers, increasing the bridge's lifespan from a few seasons to decades. Yet the overall form often remained the same: narrow, flexible, and gently swaying in the wind, as if to remind travelers that they were still in the mountain's domain. Walking across such a bridge, whether ancient or modern, changes your relationship to the landscape. The air feels different in the middle, cooler, wilder, alive with the sound of rushing water. The wind catches your clothing and hair, and for a moment, the rest of the world drops away. You are suspended between two realms, neither fully here nor there, moving forward with each deliberate step. For travelers in history, this moment was charged with both relief and tension. Relief at having reached the bridge at all, and tension in knowing that the last few paces to safety were still ahead. Even in the age of helicopters, drones, and high-speed roads, mountain bridges continue to hold their quiet authority. They stand as symbols not just of connection, but of humility, reminding us that the forces of nature cannot be erased, only respected. To cross them is to acknowledge that the path forward exists because someone, sometime, dared to string a line across the void and walk it. And so, as the evening sun dips behind jagged peaks, painting the sky in gold and violet, the silhouette of a bridge becomes more than timber, rope, or steel. It becomes the memory of countless crossings before yours, the laughter of traders, the footsteps of pilgrims, the whispered prayers of those who feared the height, and the confidence of those who did not. In that suspended moment, with the ground far below and the wind on your face, you feel a truth as old as civilization, that every crossing changes you, and every bridge carries not just people, but time itself. In the low, humid river valleys of Southeast Asia, the story of bridges follows a different rhythm from the stark, wind-bitten passes of the mountains. Here, the rivers do not roar so much as they breathe, broad, slow-moving, and brown with silt carried down from distant highlands. Yet they are no less powerful, for their seasonal floods can swell across entire plains, transforming the land into a shifting mosaic of channels, islands, and floodplains. To live in such a place has always meant learning to cross water, sometimes narrow streams, sometimes wide channels stretching to the horizon. The earliest bridges here were often barely bridges at all, just fallen logs laid across smaller channels, or woven mats of bamboo lashed together and anchored to the muddy banks. These were living structures, part of the natural cycles of the floodplain. When the waters rose, the mats would float. When the waters receded, they would rest on the exposed earth. Villagers might haul them away at the end of the wet season, to be used elsewhere or dismantled for firewood. But across the broader rivers, those that carried the main flow to the sea, bridges had to be more deliberate. Long before the arrival of colonial engineers with their steel trusses, local builders devised floating bridges made of lashed bamboo rafts, sometimes stretching hundreds of meters. They were anchored by heavy stones or piles driven deep into the mud, and they shifted gently with the currents. These crossings had their own etiquette. Carts and animals crossed in the cool of the morning, when the air was still and the river less busy. Fishermen navigated through designated gaps, where sections of the bridge could be temporarily pulled aside to let boats pass, that in the great riverine cities like Ayutthaya in Siam or Bagan in Burma, the absence of permanent stone bridges for centuries was not for lack of skill. It was a reflection of how people related to the river. Water was not simply an obstacle, it was a thoroughfare. Boats were faster than carts, and markets clustered along docks rather than at road junctions. Still, there were moments, floods, wars, or royal processions, when temporary bridges were thrown across the water, feats of coordination that involved hundreds of workers and vast supplies of bamboo, palm fiber rope, and wooden planks. The arrival of permanent bridges in the 19th and early 20th centuries altered the rhythms of life. Iron girders rose above waters that had never before been spanned in the dry season, casting sharp shadows on the ripples below. For traders and farmers, this meant easier access to markets. For colonial powers, it meant faster troop movements and a firmer grip on the territories they governed. Some of these early steel bridges still stand, their rivets weathered but intact, their decks carrying motorbikes and pedestrians where once only rafts dared float. Yet even today, in parts of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, seasonal bamboo bridges are built and dismantled in a cycle as old as the river's own tides. In Kampong, Cham, Cambodia, a famous bamboo bridge once connected the mainland to Koh Pang Island every dry season. For months, villagers worked together to drive thousands of bamboo poles into the sandy riverbed, binding them with fiber ropes until a span nearly a kilometer long took shape. It creaked and shifted underfoot, yet it could support cars, motorbikes, and the endless stream of bicycles laden with vegetables, fish, and flowers. When the rains came and the Mekong rose, the bridge was dismantled, its poles stacked away in anticipation of the next dry season. This rhythm was a kind of pact between human life and the river's will. Floating bridges in this region were not just practical, but communal. The process of building one was often accompanied by shared meals, music, and friendly competition between work teams. Children fetched water and snacks for the laborers. Elders gave advice that mixed technical know-how with superstition. It was not unusual for a small shrine to be built near the anchoring point, where offerings might be made to the river spirits to ensure safe passage for the months ahead. From an engineering perspective, Southeast Asian bamboo bridges are a masterclass in renewable design. Bamboo is light, strong, flexible, and plentiful. It can be harvested without killing the plant, and it grows back quickly. Builders understood how to orient the poles so that the natural curve of the stalks added strength to the structure. The lashing patterns, cross knots, figure eights, and tight spirals were passed down through families, each with slight variations suited to local conditions. Walking across such a bridge is unlike any other crossing. The floor yields just slightly under your feet, swaying with the movement of others ahead of you. Beneath the planks, you can see the water glinting in the sunlight, sometimes smooth and glassy, sometimes broken by the shadows of drifting vegetation. The air smells of wet earth, fish, and sun-warmed bamboo. And always, the bridge sings soft, creaks, the occasional slap of water against its side, and the faint hum of wind passing through the stalks. There is a strange poetry in the fact that so many of these bridges are temporary. They are born from the river, serve their purpose, and return to the river's embrace when the season changes. They embody impermanence, reminding us that the connections we build are often fleeting, yet no less valuable for their transience. Each time a bamboo bridge is rebuilt, it is both old and new, the same crossing reborn in fresh materials, carrying the weight of memory as much as the weight of footsteps to eye in the modern era. Concrete spans have replaced many of these seasonal crossings, and motor traffic now flows uninterrupted across waters that once dictated the pace of life. But in pockets of the countryside, the old ways persist, not as relics, but as living traditions. To walk one of these bridges is to step into a world where engineering, ecology, and culture meet in harmony, each respecting the other's place in the cycle. And so, when the morning sun rises over the mist-covered floodplains, casting a soft, golden light on the braided bamboo path stretching into the distance, the bridge becomes more than a means to cross water. It is a testament to adaptability, to the human capacity to live with the river rather than against it, and to the quiet beauty of structures that know when to stand and when to yield. Far to the west, where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic and the land curves into the edge of the known world, bridges took on a different form and meaning. Here, in the Iberian Peninsula, the rivers are often unpredictable, sometimes broad and gentle, other times narrow but surging with seasonal floods. To the people who lived here over the centuries, Phoenicians, Romans, Visigoths, Moors, and later the Christian kingdoms, the act of bridging a river was never merely a matter of convenience. It was a declaration of presence, a promise that trade, culture, and authority would flow as surely as the water beneath the arches. The Romans were among the first to lay down stone in earnest, carving their legacy in the form of massive, multi-arch spans that still stand today. The Puente Romano of Merida, with its sweeping line of granite arches stretching across the Guadiana River, was not built to be temporary. It was an expression of Roman mastery, both over nature and over the territories they ruled. Granite blocks, quarried from nearby hills, were cut and fitted with such precision that mortar was scarcely needed. These bridges were built for centuries, not seasons, and their designers considered not just the present needs, but the inevitable rise and fall of the river. That a Roman bridge in Iberia was not only a tool for soldiers and merchants, it was also a stage for daily life. Farmers leading their donkeys laden with olives or grain crossed paths with messengers bearing imperial orders, while children ran along the stone parapets, stopping to throw pebbles into the water below. The steady sound of footsteps and wheels over stone became part of the river's own song, mingling with the splash of oars and the calls of boatmen passing underneath. When the Moors came to Iberia, they brought new techniques in engineering and decoration, infusing existing bridges with flourishes of Islamic art. Arches were sometimes rebuilt with horseshoe shapes, and the surfaces were decorated with geometric patterns and calligraphic tiles. The bridges became not only crossings, but also statements of beauty, reminders that infrastructure could be both functional and poetic. The Guadalquivir in Córdoba bore witness to one of the most famous examples. The Roman bridge there, restored and adapted by Muslim builders, served as both a gateway into the city and a point of gathering. At night, Lanterns hung along its length reflected on the dark water, turning the bridge into a glowing thread between two banks. Medieval Christian kingdoms, inheriting both the Roman foundations and Moorish refinements, treated bridges as symbols of faith as much as engineering. Many were built or rebuilt by religious orders, and chapels were often added to their midpoints. Pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago might pause at such chapels to pray before continuing their journey, the sound of the river below mingling with the tolling of small bells. In this way, the bridge became both a literal and spiritual crossing. Not all bridges in Iberia were monumental stoneworks. In rural regions, timber and rope bridges still played their role, especially in mountainous areas where deep gorges and rapid rivers cut through the land. Here, a bridge could be little more than planks laid across rope supports, swaying in the wind. These crossings were not meant to last forever, and indeed they rarely did. Storms, floods, or decay would eventually claim them. But they were rebuilt, as often as they were lost, for the need to cross outweighed the fear of the crossing itself. In port cities, bridges connected not just two banks of a river, but also the land to the vast networks of trade that extended across seas. Small drawbridges and causeways linked fortifications and quays, allowing goods from faraway lands, spices from the Levant, wool from the north, silver from the New World, to pass into bustling markets. These were not the grand arches of imperial Rome, but they were no less vital to the heartbeat of the city. As the centuries turned, industrialization brought new materials and ambitions. Cast iron, steel, and reinforced concrete began to appear along Spanish and Portuguese rivers, replacing the slower rhythm of stone masonry with the faster pulse of rivets and girders. Bridges rose higher, longer, and lighter, their spans unbroken by piers, allowing ships to pass freely below. These modern structures often stood alongside their ancient predecessors, a silent dialogue between past and present. One could stand on a Roman arch in Merida, gaze downstream, and see the silhouette of a modern highway bridge against the sunset. The two structures would share the same function but speak entirely different languages, one of permanence and hand-hewn stone, the other of speed and industrial scale. Yet both are part of the same story, proof that humanity's desire to connect across divides endures, even as the tools and styles change. Today, many ancient Iberian bridges remain in daily use, their stones polished smooth by centuries of footsteps. Others have been preserved as monuments, closed to vehicles, but open to those who wish to walk and feel the slow, unhurried pace of the past. Standing on such a bridge in the quiet of early morning, with the mist rising from the river and the faint smell of wet stone in the air, one can almost hear the echoes of every traveler who ever crossed: soldiers, traders, pilgrims, lovers, exiles, all bound together by the shared act of moving forward to in the end. The story of Iberian bridges is not simply about engineering or materials. It is about the human urge to reach the other side, to turn obstacles into connections, to make the world just a little smaller. And whether built of stone, wood, or steel, every bridge here carries within it the memory of the hands that built it, the feet that crossed it, and the waters that flowed beneath it. If one follows the slow, winding course of the Danube, from its birth in the dark forests of Germany to its patient journey across Central Europe, one will eventually find it widening into a broad, commanding river that has, for centuries, both connected and divided the lands along its banks. The Danube's waters have carried trade, armies, whispers of peace, and echoes of war. Across it, bridges have risen and fallen like chapters in a long, continuous chronicle, each telling its own story of ambition, endurance, and adaptation. The first true bridges here were not monumental stone arches, but humble wooden trestles, built by local tribes for foot travel and the movement of livestock. These early crossings, lashed together with ropes and supported by driven timber piles, swayed with the wind and groaned under the strain of passing carts. They were not built for beauty or for eternity, but for necessity. Still, in their creaking simplicity, they embodied the most essential truth of a bridge, that it must lead you to the other side. Then came the Romans, whose arrival transformed the river's crossings from local conveniences into strategic lifelines of empire. They built with stone and wood, often combining massive masonry piers with wooden superstructures. Their engineers were not merely thinking about present needs. They calculated currents, flood seasons, and the heavy weight of military legions crossing in tight formation. At Drobeta, near what is now Romania, the Romans built one of the most ambitious bridges of the ancient world, under the guidance of the legendary architect Apollodorus of Damascus. This bridge, stretching over 1,100 meters, was supported by 20 sturdy stone piers, its timber roadway arching gracefully over the flowing Danube. Though the wooden deck has long since vanished, the stone piers still stand like weathered teeth in the river, reminders of a time when Roman willpower could span even the mightiest waters. Medieval Europe brought a slower rhythm to bridge building. Along the Danube, with the collapse of centralized authority after the fall of Rome, local lords, monasteries, and free cities took on the responsibility of maintaining crossings. Many bridges were rebuilt in stone, their arches reflecting both practical needs and the architectural style of the time. Pointed Gothic shapes in some regions, rounded Romanesque in others. The town of Regensburg in present-day Germany became famous for its stone bridge completed in the 12th century, an elegant series of arches that not only connected trade routes, but also stood as a testament to the prosperity of the city. Life on these bridges was never merely about transit. Merchants set up stalls along the sides, selling bread, cloth, salted fish, and trinkets to travelers. Beggars would station themselves at the busiest points, hoping for coins from wealthier passers-by. Pilgrims, bound for shrines in distant lands, would pause to pray at chapels built mid-span, while children chased each other between the legs of pack mules. The bridge was both a road and a stage, a place where the stories of countless lives intersected briefly before diverging again. The Ottoman Empire's expansion into Central Europe brought a new chapter. The Ottomans were master bridge builders in their own right, and under their rule, graceful stone structures began to appear along the Danube and its tributaries. The arches of these bridges were often slender and elegant, designed to withstand not only the weight of traffic, but also the force of spring floods. Many featured cutwaters, sharp, triangular projections on their piers to break the current and reduce strain. These were the bridges of merchants and soldiers alike, carrying goods and orders between the frontiers of a vast empire. In times of war, bridges along the Danube were often the first casualties. Armies knew that to control a river, one must control its crossings. Some were burned or dismantled to slow an enemy's advance. Others were hastily rebuilt with whatever materials lay at hand. A bridge might change hands many times in a single campaign, each side reinforcing or sabotaging it in turn. And yet, no matter how many times they fell, bridges returned, because rivers demand crossing, and people will always find a way to meet that demand. The Industrial Revolution transformed the Danube's landscape yet again. Iron and steel replaced stone as the favored materials for new bridges, allowing for longer spans without intermediate supports. The chain bridge in Budapest, completed in 1849, became a symbol not only of engineering progress, but also of national pride, linking the cities of Buda and Pest into a single metropolis. Its massive iron chains and stone towers were as much works of art as feats of construction, and its lamps, lit at night, made the crossing glow like a suspended constellation. Over the water, the 20th century was less kind. Both world wars left the Danube's bridges in ruins, blown apart by explosives or dismantled to prevent enemy use. Some cities saw their crossings destroyed more than once in a single decade. Yet after each destruction came rebuilding, sometimes in the same style, other times in new, modern forms. Today, the Danube's banks display a mosaic of bridge styles: medieval stone, Ottoman arches, iron trusses, and sleek contemporary designs that to walk across a Danube bridge at dawn is to experience. Centuries in a single moment. The stones beneath your feet may date back to the Middle Ages. The lamps above you might have been wired only a decade ago. The river flows beneath, indifferent to the structures that span it, carrying with it the reflections of towers, ships, and the faces of those who pause mid-span to look down into its depths, in the hush of early morning. With mist curling above the water and the distant toll of a church bell echoing across the city, one feels the quiet continuity of it all. Every step forward is a step in the same direction taken by countless others: traders, soldiers, lovers, exiles, dreamers, each drawn by the same simple, profound need to cross. Along the vast expanse of the Nile, where the river narrows between banks shaded by date palms and lined with clustered villages of sun-baked mud brick, bridges were, for much of history, rare as rain in the desert. The Nile itself was both a giver of life and an obstacle, its waters feeding crops and sustaining settlements, yet also dividing communities, especially when the seasonal floods transformed its banks into a wide, surging expanse. For thousands of years, ferries, rafts, and reed boats served as the main means of crossing. Bridges, when they appeared, were exceptions, constructed with purpose and patience, often tied to the ambitions of rulers or the needs of trade. In ancient Egypt, the river's seasonal flooding dictated nearly all engineering decisions. Most early crossings were temporary, built during the dry months when the Nile retreated to its narrower channel. Engineers would lay wooden planks atop piers of bundled papyrus or piles of stone, allowing foot traffic and donkey caravans to pass. When the flood returned, these simple structures were dismantled or washed away. They would reused for the next season. Bridges were, in a way, as seasonal as the harvest itself. It was under the Ptolemies, and later the Romans, that more enduring Nile crossings appeared. The Romans, inheriting centuries of Egyptian river wisdom, combined it with their own mastery of arches and masonry. They constructed sturdy stone piers sunk deep into the riverbed, atop which rose wooden or stone spans. These bridges were rare, clustered near major administrative centers like Memphis and Alexandria, where political and economic life demanded reliable year-round passage. Even so, the river's great width and unpredictable flow often limited the scale of such undertakings. Rather than spanning the main channel in a single leap, many Nile crossings of antiquity and the medieval period took advantage of the rivers. Natural islands. Builders would connect these islands with smaller spans, creating a chain of bridges and causeways. This segmented design allowed for maintenance on one section while the rest remained in use. A practical solution in a river known for both sudden floods and heavy silt deposits. As the centuries passed, Islamic Egypt inherited and adapted bridge building traditions. The Fatimids and later the Mamluks oversaw the construction of graceful stone bridges, particularly across canals and Nile tributaries. These smaller bridges, with pointed arches and carved parapets, served both functional and ceremonial purposes. Processions of dignitaries would cross them during religious festivals, while farmers drove their oxen over them with carts full of harvested grain. The architecture blended engineering with artistry, making even modest crossings into works of civic pride. One notable example was the bridge at Fustat, built in the 10th century to connect important trade districts. Though not spanning the entire Nile, It crossed a wide branch and allowed for a constant flow of goods, dates, spices, woven linen into the bustling city markets. Travelers described it as a living place, where merchants' cries mingled with the clatter of hooves and the smell of fresh bread from nearby stalls. The Ottomans, who ruled Egypt for several centuries, added their own influence. Their bridges, often built of stone with shallow arches, emphasized durability. Many Ottoman period bridges still stand today over smaller Nile channels and irrigation canals, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of footsteps and cartwheels. Unlike the towering aqueduct-like spans of Europe, these bridges were low, almost blending into the surrounding landscape, their beauty lying in their simplicity and longevity. Modern times brought iron, steel, and concrete to the Nile. In the 19th century, under Muhammad Ali and his successors, the first major permanent bridges over the main channel were built. These combined imported industrial technology with local labor, producing structures that could withstand both the rivers, seasonal floods, and the increased weight of wheeled traffic. The Qasr El Nil Bridge in Cairo, completed in the early 20th century, became an icon. Its stone lion statues standing guard at either end as trams, carriages, and later automobiles crossed between the city's banks. The construction of the Aswan Dam and other water management projects in the 20th century transformed the Nile's flow, making year-round crossings more practical and less vulnerable to flood damage. Today, sleek modern bridges carry vehicles across the river at intervals, unimaginable to ancient builders. Yet, in rural stretches, life has changed little. Villagers still rely on ferries, and small footbridges of wood and rope still connect fields and homes across narrow channels. To stand on a Nile bridge in the quiet of dawn is to feel the same timelessness that has always defined this river. The water glides by with slow authority, carrying the reflections of palm fronds, fishing boats, and the faint shimmer of minarets in the distance. You might see farmers leading donkeys across, schoolchildren holding hands as they skip toward a village, or an old fisherman pausing mid-span to watch the current, as if searching for something he lost long ago, and as the first rays of sunlight turn the water to gold. It is easy to imagine the countless generations who have stood in this very place: Pharaoh's subjects, Roman soldiers, Fatimid merchants, Ottoman guards, British engineers, all drawn to this same crossing point by the same ancient need to reach the other side. In the dry, wind-swept expanses of Mesopotamia, where rivers defined both the boundaries and the heart of civilization, the story of bridges is inseparable from the twin currents of the Tigris and Euphrates. These rivers were lifelines, threading through lands of dust and clay, carrying water to the date palms and wheat fields, while also posing a constant challenge to the movement of people and goods. In the world's first cities, Uruk, Lagash, and later Babylon, crossings were as essential to urban life as the walls that defended the city or the canals that fed it. The earliest bridges here were humble yet ingenious, made of bundled reeds, tied together into buoyant mats, or of logs floated on inflated goatskins. They could be assembled quickly and dismantled when the river's mood changed. These were the bridges of shepherds and traders, temporary lifelines stretched over the restless currents. And while they lacked the permanence of stone, they allowed life to flow across the riverbanks without interruption. It was with the rise of organized states in Sumer and Akkad that more ambitious structures appeared. Clay tablets from as early as the 3rd millennium BCE describe causeways and wooden trestle bridges, supported by stone piers sunk into the silty riverbed. These bridges connected temple districts, marketplaces, and palace precincts, allowing the great ceremonial processions of the gods to cross with solemn grace. The bridge itself could be a sacred space, decorated with banners, garlands, and votive offerings. Babylon, under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, boasted one of the most celebrated crossings of the ancient world. The Euphrates cut through the heart of the city, and here rose a massive stone pier bridge topped with thick timbers. Herodotus, visiting centuries later, wrote of its breadth and its alignment with the city's great processional way, so that during festivals the statues of the gods could pass directly from one temple to another without breaking the sacred journey. At night, oil lamps along the parapets cast wavering light upon the river below, turning the bridge into a ribbon of fire over water. The Assyrians, with their relentless military campaigns, viewed bridges as instruments of empire. Their engineers built pontoon bridges from boats lashed together and covered with planks, allowing armies to cross rivers in a matter of hours. Relief carvings from Nineveh show soldiers marching across such floating spans, shields on their backs, chariots following, while scribes recorded the moment for the king's annals. These temporary bridges were not meant to last, but their impact on the speed and reach of Assyrian power was enduring. When the Persians inherited Mesopotamia, they expanded its bridge network as part of their imperial road system. The Royal Road, which stretched from Sardis to Susa, crossed multiple rivers, each spanned by carefully engineered stone or wooden bridges. Persian builders favored wide, low arches for stability and often flanked their bridges with guardhouses. The bridges were not only functional but symbols of imperial authority, carrying the king's messengers on swift horses and the goods of distant provinces into the empire's core. Under the Islamic caliphates, bridge building in Mesopotamia entered a new phase. The Abbasids, ruling from their glittering capital at Baghdad, constructed elegant stone bridges across the Tigris and its tributaries. These were often adorned with pointed arches and patterned brickwork, combining utility with beauty. The bridges became part of the city's identity, linking the administrative heart with its sprawling markets, gardens, and scholarly quarters. During the spring floods, when the river swelled with snowmelt from the mountains, people would gather along the parapets to watch the waters rush beneath them. A reminder of nature's power and the fragility of human craft. In the later Ottoman era, many of these ancient and medieval crossings were rebuilt or replaced with sturdier structures. The Ottomans introduced wider stone spans with shallow arches, designed to withstand both floods and the heavy carts of a growing trade economy. They also built smaller bridges over irrigation canals, often with simple but elegant balustrades, so that even remote villages could remain connected year-round. The 19th century, the arrival of European engineers and new materials transformed Mesopotamian bridges again. Iron trusses appeared alongside ancient stonework, blending industrial modernity with the deep historical roots of the landscape. These hybrid structures, stone piers topped with metal latticework, symbolized a region at the meeting point of old and new worlds. Yet, even with all the advances, the simplest crossings endured. In rural areas, villagers still stretched wooden planks over narrow streams, or ferried people across in boats tethered to ropes. A traveler might, in the same day, walk across a bridge older than his great-grandfather and another built within the past decade, each serving the same eternal purpose: to join what the river had divided. To stand on a bridge over the Tigris at sunset is to feel the weight of all these centuries. The river's surface mirrors the sky's fading light, while in the distance, the call to prayer drifts across the water. You might hear the creak of a cartwheel, the soft murmur of merchants speaking in many tongues, or the splash of an oar striking the current. The bridge beneath your feet is solid, but the sense of time is fluid, carrying you, like the river itself, from the age of reed mats and goatskin floats to the enduring arches of stone and steel. Far to the west of Mesopotamia, where the blue waters of the Mediterranean meet the sun-baked lands of Greece, bridges carried not only people and goods, but also the ideas that would shape much of Western civilization. In this rugged land of mountains and islands. Valleys often cut deep into the earth, and rivers swelled suddenly with winter rains before dwindling to trickles in summer. Crossing them required more than convenience. It required ingenuity. The earliest Greek bridges were modest, much like those of other early cultures. Wooden planks were laid over stone supports, or bound logs were set across narrow streams. But by the late Bronze Age, the Mycenaeans, builders of citadels and great beehive tombs, were already experimenting with stone structures that could last for centuries. One of the oldest known examples, the bridge at Archidiko in the Peloponnese, still stands after more than 3,000 years. Built from massive limestone blocks, it features a simple corbelled arch and a narrow roadway designed for chariots. Its endurance is a testament to the skill of its builders and the resilience of their materials that in the classical era, bridges took on a civic importance. The Greek city-states, with their agorae, theaters, and temples, relied on good infrastructure to keep life moving. While many towns were built near the sea and used harbors for trade, inland roads needed to cross rivers efficiently. Wooden bridges supported by stone abutments were common, and their upkeep was often managed by the city itself. The responsibility for maintaining them could even fall to wealthy citizens as part of their civic duty, what the Greeks called liturgy. Bridges also appeared in the context of sacred landscapes. Pilgrimage routes to sanctuaries, such as Olympia or Delphi, often required crossing rivers, and these crossings could be marked by small shrines or carved boundary stones. In some cases, bridges were adorned with inscriptions dedicating them to the gods, turning a simple passage over water into an act of devotion. The Macedonian Empire under Philip II and Alexander the Great expanded the Greek world far beyond its earlier boundaries. Military campaigns required rapid movement across varied terrain, and engineers learned to build temporary wooden or rope bridges that could be assembled and dismantled quickly. Accounts from Alexander's campaigns describe pontoon bridges over rivers in Asia Minor and the Indus Valley, enabling the army to advance where otherwise it might have been halted. These were not meant to endure, but they demonstrated the Greek mastery of practical engineering when urgency demanded it. When Greece fell under Roman rule, bridge construction entered a new age. Roman engineers introduced the true arch to the Greek landscape, replacing corbelled forms with graceful curves of precisely cut stone. The Romans also brought with them concrete, allowing for stronger and longer-lasting spans. Many bridges in the Greek provinces became part of the imperial road network, linking ports to inland cities and fortresses. The stone piers of these Roman bridges often rose directly from the riverbed, their bases shaped like wedges to split the current, while the arches above provided clearance for floods. One notable example was the bridge at Amphipolis in Macedonia, which crossed the Strymon River. It combined stone piers with a wooden deck and served as a key link in the Via Egnatia, the great road connecting the Adriatic to Byzantium. Through it passed merchants, soldiers, and officials, along with caravans laden with grain, wine, and olive oil. The bridge was not only a physical connector, but also part of a trade network that bound together distant corners of the empire. Byzantine rule continued many of these traditions, repairing and rebuilding bridges while adding their own touches, such as pointed arches and decorative brick patterns. Some Byzantine bridges included small chapels at one end, offering travelers a place to give thanks for a safe crossing or to pray before setting out. In mountainous areas, bridges sometimes leapt dramatically from one rock outcrop to another, the narrow arch seeming almost to hang in the air above a rushing gorge. In the Ottoman period, Greek bridges often took on the distinctive features of Islamic architecture. Stone arches became more pronounced, and the decks were sometimes paved with irregular cobblestones. Bridges like the one at Arda, with its long, low span and elegant silhouette, became both practical tools and works of art. Folk songs and legends grew around them, weaving tales of sacrifice and supernatural forces, as though to explain the mystery of their endurance. By the 19th century, under a mix of Ottoman rule and European influence, iron began to appear in Greek bridges. Industrial materials allowed for lighter structures that could cross wider gaps without multiple piers. Yet in many rural villages, stone masonry continued to dominate, with local craftsmen shaping each block by hand and fitting it so precisely that no mortar was needed. These village bridges, often just wide enough for a cart or a few pedestrians, blended seamlessly into their surroundings, as though they had grown there like the olive trees, standing today on an ancient Greek bridge. One might feel the layers of history beneath one's feet. The limestone blocks, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, tell of charioteers and traders, pilgrims and soldiers, shepherds and scholars. Below, the river flows on, indifferent to human struggles, yet made navigable by human ingenuity. The bridge remains, solid, enduring, and quietly carrying the weight of time. Beyond the sunlit shores of Greece, the land of Rome would take the concept of bridging to a scale and permanence unmatched in the ancient world. The Romans did not merely build bridges, they built monuments in stone and concrete that could bear the weight of empires. For them, a bridge was not only a practical necessity, but a statement of power, stability, and control over nature itself. Long before Rome rose to dominance, the Italian peninsula had seen bridges of wood and stone crafted by the Etruscans and other Italic peoples. These early crossings were modest, yet they established the principle that rivers could be tamed and woven into the fabric of human movement. The Romans inherited this foundation, but transformed it into something greater through innovation and relentless ambition. Central to their success was the mastery of the true arch. Unlike the corbelled structures of earlier civilizations, the Roman arch distributed weight evenly across its curve, allowing for wider spans and stronger supports. Combined with their discovery and use of pozzolanic concrete, a mixture that hardened underwater, this allowed them to build bridges that resisted the ravages of floods, time, and war. The Pons Emilius, known today as the Ponte Rotto, broken bridge, once stretched across the Tiber in Rome. Completed in stone in the 2nd century BCE, it was a marvel of engineering, its arches rising gracefully over the flowing water. Even though much of it has collapsed, a single arch still stands, a weathered sentinel to the skill of its builders. This bridge was not only a means of crossing the river, but also a symbol of the city's permanence, an assertion that the capital of the Republic, and later the Empire, could outlast generations. Roman bridges were not limited to the city itself. Across their vast territories, they built hundreds, perhaps thousands, of spans that formed vital links in their road network. The Via Appia, the Queen of Roads, relied on numerous bridges as it stretched south toward Brindisi. The Via Flaminia, heading north toward the Adriatic, crossed the Tiber at the Ponte Milvio, a bridge that would witness centuries of history, from the campaigns of ancient generals to the famous Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, where Constantine claimed victory under the sign of the cross. Far from the heart of Italy, Roman engineers carried their skills to the frontiers. In Spain, the Alcantara Bridge stands as perhaps the finest surviving example of Roman bridge building. Completed around 106 CE under Emperor Trajan, it spans the Tagus River with 6 massive arches, each perfectly proportioned. Inscribed above the central arch are the words Pontum Perpetui Mansurum in Secula, a bridge to last forever. The boast was not idle. Nearly 2 millennia later, it still serves travelers in the East. Roman legions built pontoon bridges of boats, lashed together, enabling rapid troop movements across wide rivers like the Danube. Julius Caesar himself famously constructed a timber bridge over the Rhine in just 10 days during his Gallic campaigns. a feat as much about intimidation as utility. The message to the tribes beyond was clear: Rome could cross any boundary, natural or political. The genius of Roman bridge building lay not only in design but also in standardization. Engineers could replicate proven techniques anywhere in the empire, adapting them to local materials and terrain. Stone piers were often faced with cut ashlar blocks and filled with rubble and concrete. Their foundations sunk deep into the riverbed using cofferdams. Many included cutwaters, pointed projections on the upstream side, to split the current and reduce pressure. Even as the empire declined, Roman bridges endured. In some places, medieval builders simply repaired and reused them, their original arches still intact. The persistence of these structures inspired awe and curiosity among later generations, who sometimes attributed their construction to mythical giants or vanished races. Bridges also played a role in Roman daily life beyond military and trade purposes. Some spanned aqueducts, carrying water as well as people. Others served as gathering places, lined with vendors and entertainers. In Rome itself, the Pons Fabricius, built in 62 BCE, still connects the Tiber Island to the city, its original Latin inscription intact. A bridge that has been in continuous use for over 2,000 years. To stand upon one of these ancient arches today is to feel the weight of centuries compressed into stone. Each block, each joint of mortarless precision, tells of a world in which human determination could bend rivers to its will. The water flows on, as it did when legions marched across, as it did when merchants led their carts, as it does now beneath the footsteps of tourists. But above it all remains the Roman bridge, quiet, steadfast, and almost eternal.